All right, it's November 27th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and this is our first meeting for classical mathematics. These classes in the evenings are intended for adults. I don't let adults attend meetings where I have all the kids during the day, for obvious reasons. But in the evening, these are open to students, but they're also just intended really for adults, where we can dig into some things in a way that I don't think we have the opportunity to dig into in any other formats. So what I plan to do is prepare content for each week. And again, there's no assignments or anything. There's nothing for you to ever have to worry about preparing. And I'll present some information that I think will make for some conversation and discussion afterwards, or follow-up conversations. I'll prepare a lot of content, so I'll try to make these meetings worthwhile. But at the same time, I'm going to explain the goals that I have for these classes, which I think you'll appreciate because, I participate in class meetings and stuff myself and find a lot of it to be really boring and useless. But I want to get after some helpful goals with these studies and sort of open things up a little bit in the sense of getting into studies and topics that we don't have much of a chance to talk about and think about in modern society. So what my goal is for these meetings, this is the real challenge. I don't know how many of you went to college, how much college studies you did, anything like that. It doesn't matter. But if you took philosophy courses in college, they're really usually pretty terrible. And the reason why they're terrible is because normally the professors are not philosophers. They're not men like Aristotle. They're not men like St. Thomas Aquinas. They're academics, and they're usually reporting about philosophy. They're reporting about philosophers. They're reporting about ideas and books that have been written. And they really don't practice the life of philosophy. And so it's very dry, it's very boring, it's uninteresting. And every different philosopher is given equal treatment. So you'll have, a class or two on Aristotle, and then you'll have another class on some modern philosopher who's almost irrelevant historically, and they're given the same attention, the same time, and their influence in human history is nowhere comparable, and yet they're given, like I said, almost the same time. And so you get this overview of philosophy that's really useless, boring, dead. And when I started in classical studies, I just couldn't take it. I couldn't stand the classes. I couldn't take how boring it all was because I knew it wasn't supposed to be that way. So I asked for permission to do independent study when I was an undergraduate and pursue the authors and readings and books that I knew were studied in the past. And that's where the Classical Liberal Arts Academy really came from. Those studies and pursuits of the real philosophers, the real philosophical books, the influential ideas. And it's that spirit of real philosophy that I want to share with you. I want to get into this. I want to introduce as many of you to it as I can. I don't say that arrogantly as if I have access to some kind of secret knowledge, but I think I do have access to a lot of information and resources that aren't commonly accessible today. And I'd like to try to make a lot of this available to you. And what I think will be the benefit of it is you'll see the practical use of it. You'll see that this isn't survey type talk. This isn't college class type talk. This is real practical everyday life. Make yourself a better person, become holy, become wise, real life philosophy to actually practice. Like when the kids study ethics in classical ethics, one of the first things they learn from Aristotle is that the goal of moral philosophy is to become good men. That's the goal. It's not to learn trivia about philosophical ideas, not to know the definitions of terms. It's to actually become good people, to learn what it means to be good and to actually be good. And that's what real philosophy is about. It's about being happy. That's the chief end of the human life, to be happy. And true philosophy helps us to be happy. And that's sort of the test for whether or not it's true philosophy. Is it actually leading us to happiness, which is the end of the human life? Obviously, most college philosophy classes are not leading us to happiness, and that's proof that they're not true philosophy, not even really true human studies. So what I'd like to do tonight, I prepared a few documents with some information that I'd like to share and introduce you to some things that I think will be helpful. And then as we go through this stuff, we can explore these things, as you wish. If we get into something that you find interesting, if there's a topic you'd like to dig into, something you'd like to ask, feel free to ask. But I'm just going to throw a handful of rocks at you, and we'll see what hits. But it's a lot of good information. Probably feel overwhelming tonight, but we can. I don't say we can. I should say we're going to continue to talk about these same topics and repeat these issues again and again each week as we actually get into these studies. The first thing I want to share, and I'm going to share my screen, so you can just follow along with me here. Gene, I know you're driving, so don't follow my screen. Keep your eyes on the road. I'll share links to these documents, so you don't have to worry about anything, okay? But I'll be sure to explain everything in words so you can listen and follow along. This first document is just a chronology, because I'm not going to take it for granted that everyone knows who these people are or when these things took place. But it's just a simple chronology that I think is good for you to print out and stick in a notebook or fold up and stick in a book and keep a hold on. And I'm going to explain what's significant about this chronology. What we have here is a chronology of ancient mathematicians, and these are people and names that we're going to refer to a lot. It's good to know where they are in chronology, because by learning chronology, you can answer most of the questions that you have about these people just by looking at where they are in history. It clears up a lot of issues and confusion. So this simple list, the most well-known ancient mathematicians, names we'll refer to all the time in these classes. And I just want to walk through the chronology here and make some comments. I wrote the World Chronology course, so I'm a chronology geek, and the reason why I put so much emphasis on chronology, like I said, is if you know the chronology of different people and events, you can usually just think about the people and the events and draw all kinds of important conclusions just by knowing the order in which things took place. So chronology is usually the first place that I would recommend starting to think about these people and the history of philosophy and the ideas, how they developed through time, and so on. So when we go back ancient times, most historians consider the Babylonians to be the founders of ancient mathematics. The Babylonians, and we talk about Babylonians, we're talking around 2500 BC. 2500 BC, ancient Babylon. Now, what's significant about ancient Babylon is that that's where Abraham is from. And if you look down, you see Abraham around 1800 BC. Abraham was a Chaldean. Chaldeans were Babylonians. So Abraham is actually taken from ancient Babylon. His father and his family leave Ur of the Chaldees, and they move into the Promised Land, into Canaan. But tradition teaches us that Abraham was one of these Babylonians who had a knowledge of mathematics, ancient mathematics. And that brings some very interesting considerations or meditations into our study of sacred scripture. Normally, because of Protestant influences, we've got this idea that all of the patriarchs, all of the prophets, all of the apostles were fishermen who were uneducated, and they were just like nice manual laborers. They were just friendly, good guys. But when we actually get into traditional teaching about these people, we find that there's a lot more to these patriarchs and prophets, even apostles. And it's good for us to understand the significance of that in not only helping us to understand scripture, but to understand the history and development of philosophy and how it relates to the Catholic faith. So one of the first ancient mathematicians in tradition is Abraham. He is considered one of the fathers of mathematics, and you can find old paintings of Abraham teaching the Egyptians geometry. There's one old painting I have in mind where you can see that. In the book that I make available, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, I get into this a little bit with more detail. So if you're interested, you could just follow that up there. But Abraham, not in Protestant tradition, they don't talk about this, but in Catholic tradition, where there's a philosophical tradition, Abraham is considered an ancient mathematician in history. And he's a Babylonian. Some even say that through Abraham and the influence of Babylonians, that's where Egyptian mathematics, or part of Egyptian mathematics, developed. So there's this connection in the ancient world between the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Hebrews in these ancient philosophical studies, largely because of Abraham. So keep those in mind. The Babylonians, Egyptians, and the Hebrews all have this connection with respect to mathematics and ancient philosophy long before we have the law of Moses or the foundation of Israel or anything like that. There's an ancient philosophical connection between these ancient nations, which is going to become significant later on. If we go forward in the history, we get to Moses, and many would think, what in the world does Moses have to do with mathematics? Well, Moses lived around 1400 BC. The Hebrews were in captivity for 400 years, and Moses is raised up at the end of that time of captivity. And again, that's around 1400 BC. And one thing we learn is that he is raised as a prince of Egypt, all the Disney stuff, but there's truth in that. He's raised as a prince in Egypt, and he's given a royal education while he's growing up in Egypt. This is mentioned in the New Testament. We're told, I think it's St. Stephen, early in the book of Acts, we're told that Moses was raised with the education of the Egyptians, which was a mathematical, ancient philosophical education. So Moses was another ancient mathematical philosopher in his own right. All right, so Moses enters into this tradition of ancient mathematics. And it's very simple. And again, I point this out in that Understanding Classical Catholic Education book. To read the book of Genesis and take all the mathematical information for granted is part of the problem we have, because we're living thousands of years after the fact, and we don't think much of the calendar. We don't think much of talk about the solar system and the planets and things like, we just take it for granted. It's just such common knowledge. But to think that Moses is writing about all of these things, all of the heavenly bodies, the months, the weeks, the seasons, the days, the years, talking about the systems of the zodiac and the stars, talking about all these things in the book of Genesis in 1400 BC, it's really profound to think of how much mathematical knowledge was necessary to communicate the content of the book of Genesis. It's all mathematics. And again, we take that for granted when we read it today, because we've got calendars hanging on our walls and on our phones, and no one even thinks that to study to know the calendar is a big deal. But even through the Middle Ages, one of the goals of mathematical studies was just to understand the calendar, which was considered mysterious to some degree. I mean, it was still being reformed in the Middle Ages. So we take that stuff for granted, but to go back and read the book of Genesis with all of the mathematical, geometrical, astronomical information, even musical information in the first 5 books of Moses, and ignore the fact that people don't know that in the ancient world, and that it's being written by this man named Moses, who had an Egyptian ancient philosophical education, that all becomes, I don't know, visible to us when we finally realize where this is happening in history. When I talk about this stuff with the kids, they're always shocked to think that Moses was writing 1,000 years before Plato or Socrates or Aristotle, 1,000 years before the Greek philosophers. The books of the first 5 books of the Bible were already written. That's really crazy to think about when you put it into chronological perspective. But Moses was around 1400 BC. Now, when we get to the Greek philosophers, notice how the dates, how much later this is. Thales is considered one of the fathers of Greek mathematics, and Thales comes onto the scene. He's born in the 7th century before Christ. So we're talking 700 years later. 700 years after Moses, we have this rise of Greek mathematical philosophy with the man Thales. What's significant about Thales as well is that he is said to have learned mathematics by traveling to Egypt. So he is basically an Egyptian philosopher who brings that Egyptian philosophy into Greece. And as you get into Plato, if you read the dialogues of Plato, you'll see that there's this constant reference to Egyptian philosophy and Egyptian culture, which the Greeks admired. So again, we've got Abraham, Moses, and Thales, all with these connections to the ancient Near East, all with connections to ancient Egypt and ancient mathematical philosophy. So even though we've got sacred history and sacred philosophy developing, let's say, in Israel with the Hebrews, these other branches of philosophy in these other places, they're all connected. It's not this disconnected, this philosophy rising up here, this one rising up over here, and they all are separate. That's not how it actually is. These things are all connected. These philosophers know about one another. Their traditions and their cultures interact with one another. And there's this ancient tradition that's connected among these civilizations in mathematical philosophy. So when we refer to the ancients and we talk about ancient wisdom and the ancients, we're talking about this ancient culture of philosophy that was really shared by a number of different nations and established a relationship between all of them in the ancient world. The next name is where most math philosophy classes begin, with Pythagoras. Even kids today in schools, we learned about Pythagoras and in geometry class about the Pythagorean theorem, just, clueless, stuff that we're taught. We had no idea what that meant or anything, just some random trick to solve geometry problems in a modern math class. But Pythagoras was another of these ancient mathematical philosophers. And what's significant about Pythagoras was he believed that happiness, human happiness, could only be achieved through mathematical studies. So this is what's significant here. Pythagoras believed that mathematics was the means to understand human happiness. And I'm going to show you in a little bit how he thought like that, or why he thought that, because Ptolemy talks about it in his astronomy book. So what's important to remember about Pythagoras is he believed that happiness was only attainable through mathematical studies, through mathematical contemplation, which we'll talk about later on. Then we get to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and we come into a totally different phase in philosophy because Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle disagree with Pythagoras. They don't believe that happiness comes through mathematical studies. They believe that it's important. It's an important part of philosophy, but they believe that more is needed in order to pursue happiness than Pythagoras suggested. They believe that metaphysical studies, even moral philosophy, is really where human happiness is pursued. And so, for example, we see Socrates digging into all kinds of moral discussions and moral debates. He's really a moral philosopher. Plato gets a little more theoretical, getting into the doctrines of forms and all these different things. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to ascend to a knowledge of what is eternal and unchanging and satisfying to the human soul. And the question is, how do we get there? How do we get to those thoughts? How do we get to that knowledge? How do we get that real everlasting wisdom? Because the argument is that's what our souls are yearning for. They're yearning for this union with, what they call the good, the ultimate good. And the question is, how do we get it? How do we get it? And the philosophers are arguing and searching to try to figure out, what do we need to do find and reach this satisfaction. So Socrates and Plato have different opinions, and then Aristotle comes along with yet different opinions. Aristotle's not a mathematician, but I just wanted to put him in this list for the sake of reference, so we see where he enters in. And obviously, Aristotle becomes very significant in Catholic history because we have scholastic philosophy developing when St. Thomas Aquinas basically proves that Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology harmonize and should be considered two sides of the same coin. So Aristotle's in there just for reference. Then we have Euclid, who's famous for his geometry. And notice the dates, 325 to 265 BC. So after Aristotle comes Euclid. Now, when we see Euclid's geometry, Euclid doesn't invent this geometry. He simply collects it. So all of these geometrical propositions and proofs, they've been developed by philosophers for centuries. And what Euclid does, even though he contributes to some degree, he collects all of these proofs together into one system of geometry, which is called the Elements of Euclid. So he's the great geometrician, 325 BC. Then we have Nicomachus. That's how you pronounce that name, Nicomachus. And if you're ever wondering how to figure out how to pronounce these names, the best way to do it is just go on to something like Wikipedia, look up the name, and what they'll usually give you the original language form of the name, and the original language form will have the actual original letters and accent marks, so you can see, how these names are supposed to be pronounced. But that's an easy way to figure out pronunciation. Just look to the original language for the name, and it'll give you accentuation and things like that. But it's Nicomachus. Look at his dates. He lived after or into the Christian era, after Christ, 60 to 120 AD. He is another one of these compilers or collectors of ancient teaching, but he's an arithmetician. So we have his work on arithmetic, which is called Introduction to Arithmetic. Not that he actually, discovered arithmetic or wrote he simply collected all that was known at the time, Pythagorean knowledge of arithmetic, and gave us a collection of it, a textbook as it were. Then number 12, we see Ptolemy. Ptolemy is the great astronomer. And again, he's 85 to 165 AD, so well into the Christian era. Ptolemy the astronomer. And the astronomy of Ptolemy, as much as it's bad-mouthed today, that remained the astronomical system through the Middle Ages until the Copernican revolution. So you're talking 1,500 years where that view of astronomy was maintained all through Catholic history up until the time of Copernicus, the scientific revolution. So Ptolemy was the astronomer who wrote a book called the Almagest, which we're actually going to look at in a minute. And then lastly, the last name I put on here is Boethius. The only reason he's on here, he's a Christian who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries. He did a lot of work translating these ancient works, usually into Latin, which even though many of us don't know Latin, it brings it one step closer to us and provides a useful resource for studies when we're even less aware of the Greek language. His Latin translations are a helpful middle step, as it were. So that's a good chronology of these ancient Greek mathematicians, from Abraham and the Babylonians down through Boethius in the 6th century. Okay. Jared, I see you posted a link there. Is that a link to that picture I mentioned? Abraham teaching geometry or whatever? Okay, yeah, good, thank you. All right, so that's a good flyover of the chronology, okay? And again, I don't expect you to remember that or memorize that or anything, but just have this document. I'll stick a link in the chat right now for those of you who didn't get it before. Here's a link to that chronology. I recommend you just save this stuff for future reference, but I'll provide links to it all somewhere. But anyway, that's the chronology. So the important names we're going to be talking about, the dates, and it's good for us to just read through that list. Just read through that list and look at the dates and just reflect on the dates. Think about those dates, look at the relationships between the different times and philosophers. Think of other chronological events that occur in those same times or between those times. Meditating on chronology reveals a lot of truth about different subjects. And this is really a fascinating chronology to think about. For example, if you just think about Aristotle, he is the tutor to Alexander the Great. So around 325, let's say 320, in the 320s BC, you've got Alexander conquering the whole world and dragging Aristotelian philosophy with him through all these Eastern nations. So what's happening during that time? You've got this ancient mathematical tradition being bulldozed in a way by this new Aristotelian tradition. Is that good or bad? That's a controversial question to think about. You've got this Hellenization or this Greekification of the Eastern world, which already had a philosophical tradition. And then you've got the works of Aristotle more or less disappearing. You've got Platonism filling and directing the years of the church fathers in the early church, only to have Aristotle show up again and basically do to Europe what he did to the Near East at the time of Alexander the Great. So he sort of wipes out all of this Platonic philosophy of European civilization when scholasticism is established. So just by tracing and thinking about the chronology, you can come up with all sorts of interesting deductions from it that really help to fill in your knowledge and raise all kinds of interesting questions and topics for further exploration. So keep that chronology, and like I said, just read through it, look at the dates, think about the significance of the relationships of those dates, and you'll find a number of interesting thoughts arise as you do so. So that's a good flyover of the people and the dates that we're going to be talking about a lot in these meetings. Now, there's two different things I prepared tonight. There's no way that I can get through both of them. So what I think I'm going to do tonight, I prepared here a distillation of Book 7 of Plato's Republic, which I think I'm going to talk about tonight and share with you to give you some stuff to chew on. But I've also brought the first chapter of Ptolemy's Almagest because he introduces the benefit of mathematics in that first chapter, which is an important discussion. We might need to save that one, but we'll start with Socrates because I think this is most interesting. Now, Plato's Republic is an enormous work. It's composed of 10 books, Plato's Republic, 10 books, and each book is considered a separate dialogue. So it's really 10 different dialogues. And in Book 7, we have a very interesting discussion between Socrates and another man named Glaucon, who's really not important, but we have this discussion between Socrates and Glaucon about how the leaders of society should be educated. So it's this discussion about the ideal education. And what I've done here, it's pages and pages and pages. One thing that's obnoxious about Plato is you've got to spend so much time reading to actually get so little content, as opposed to Aristotle, who gives you in one sentence more than you can understand in a week. Plato's the opposite. You have to read and read and read to distill a sentence here, a sentence there. And what I've done here is basically taken most of Book 7, cleared out all the fat and all the filler, and just boiled it down to the essential lines of that book, which really reveal the point that he's making in the book. And you can see I can fit it on one page, which would have been so nice if Plato just did this for us instead of giving us these dialogues. So here we have really a summary, and these are all words from the actual English translation of Plato's Republic. This isn't my writing. I just took the whole text of book 7 and I just deleted every unnecessary line and distilled it into this one page here for us. It's Socrates, Plato presenting Socrates discussing the quadrivium, which are the 4 mathematical arts. And the topic is, how should the leaders of society, the best men, how should they be educated? And it starts with a principle up here at the top, and I hope that you can see this and follow me on this. Google Docs isn't the best for doing this, but good enough. The principle at the beginning, Socrates says, the best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And you'll notice this is philosophical language. It takes some, if you're not familiar with philosophy studies, it takes some time just to get used to some of these terms. But I mentioned this before, the philosophers really were debating and fighting with each other to answer the question, how can we attain happiness for as many people as possible, not just even for ourselves, not just for a lonely philosopher, but how can the philosophers pursue happiness for all of their neighbors? That's really a higher end than seeking one's own happiness, seeking the happiness of everyone. And so the principle of this education, Socrates says, is that the best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And notice the capital G on the good. The best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. So that's the objective. Then the question is, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we bring about this ascent to the good, whatever that even means? And that's the subject of book 7 in Plato's Republic. And so Socrates begins and he says, well, there are a number of studies, a number of subjects that enable us to make this ascent, that allow our minds to continue to ascend until we reach the good. And he explains what they are, and lo and behold, they're the 4 mathematical arts. Music, actually, that's not right. Arithmetic is the first one, obviously. Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So this is explained in book 7. Now, before I said Pythagoras was a mathematical philosopher who believed that happiness is attained through mathematics. And then I said Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle didn't agree with Pythagoras. And yet here I am showing you that Socrates taught that we pursue the good through the mathematical arts. Well, is that a contradiction? Didn't I just say the opposite? No, because if we go down to the last line, which I put in bold here, after Plato, Socrates, it's Plato presenting Socrates as the speaker. When he gets through all this talk on mathematics, he makes this final statement. All of this mathematical study is but the prelude to the actual strain which we have to learn. And he goes on to explain that the next step after we've completed the mathematical sciences, the next step is dialectic, or the science of reasoning. So I want you to see in this that even though I say that Plato and Socrates didn't agree with Pythagoras, that doesn't mean that mathematical studies were not still central to the pursuit of happiness through philosophy, according to Plato. So what does he say about these things? I want to walk through these 4 sciences and show what Socrates said is valuable about these 4 mathematical sciences. The first one is arithmetic. And remember, the goal is intellectually to ascend to the good, whatever that means, right? We have this philosophical language. What does that even mean? We'll see what Socrates explains. The first study was arithmetic. And he says, the philosopher, because he has to rise out of the sea of change and lay hold of true being, must be an arithmetician. And again, we've got all this philosophy talk that has to be unpacked. And it's good for us to see this because it gives us stuff to talk about. What does this mean? What does that mean? What in the world is he talking about? And so on. But I think if you just consider what he's saying, you can get a gist of where this is going. The philosopher, because he has to rise out of the sea of change, right? The world of senses and material things where there's constant change, constant birth and death, decay, disappointment, and so on. A philosopher, a lover of wisdom, has to rise up out of that through philosophical contemplation. He's got to free himself from that to sort of intellectually rise up above it. It's like moving from social media to the study of philosophy, right? He's got to get up away from the crowd, away from the mob, away from all the normal mess and distraction of common human life. And he's got to separate himself for the pursuit of wisdom. He's got to rise out of the sea of change and lay hold, intellectually speaking, of true being. He's got to focus his mind on that which does not change, that which is eternal and constant. This is the source of all of his stability and happiness in life, by laying hold of true being. And to do this, he must be an arithmetician. Now, how in the world does that come as the conclusion to that need of the philosopher? In modern Christian circles, we would make this kind of simple and silly and say, he needs to read the Bible, or he needs to go to church, or he needs to study the catechism. But Plato teaches that no, he needs to become an arithmetician. And we can ask, well, is this contradicting Catholic teaching, or is this in harmony with Catholic teaching? Those are good questions to dig into, right? But Plato says that in order to make this ascent intellectually, he needs to become an arithmetician. And what does that mean? He must carry on the study until he sees the nature of numbers with the mind only. That is, he separates the idea of number from material things. So we're not talking about elementary calculations and abacuses and counting things or multiplying money and trying to figure out all the different operations of arithmetic. He's got to move beyond that to more purely intellectual, contemplative thoughts of the nature of number itself, and that this subject, the study of the nature of number, is a natural and easy way for man to make this ascent out of this common mess of human stuff. So mathematics is like an easy to ascend stairway out of this world's distractions. He says, this will be the easiest way to pass from becoming to truth and being. Becoming means things constantly changing. It's like everything is in a state of becoming something else. Moving away from that, no longer focusing our attention on that sort of thing, unstable, always changing, unreliable, and so on, and focusing on truth and being meaning constant existence, things that don't change. Math, he says, or arithmetic, is the easiest way for him to make this ascent. Arithmetic has a very great and elevating effect, compelling the soul to reason about abstract number, again, not common arithmetic. We're talking about abstract number, and rebelling against the introduction of visible or tangible objects into the argument. This knowledge may be truly called necessary, necessitating, as it clearly does, the use of pure intelligence in the attainment of pure truth. So the first study that's needed is the study of arithmetic, because it's the easiest way for the soul to move from all of the stuff of the material world to the contemplation of intellectual things, things that don't change. All right, that's the first subject, arithmetic. Socrates goes on to the second study, which is geometry. He says the knowledge at which geometry aims is knowledge of the eternal. So we're not talking about triangles and squares and circles and how to figure out the area of a field or the area of a, that's really not what geometry is for in philosophy. The knowledge at which geometry aims is the knowledge of the eternal, not of anything perishing or transient, not of anything changing, not of anything material or sensible. Geometry will draw the soul towards truth and create the spirit of philosophy, will create the spirit of philosophy. Now, you may know the story that Plato at his academy would not admit anyone to his academy who hadn't studied geometry. Well, now you know why, because he taught that geometry creates the spirit of philosophy and raises up that which is now unhappily allowed to fall down. That's the second study. Third, astronomy. We make astronomy the third. The spangled heavens should be used as a pattern with a view to higher knowledge. So the goal of astronomy is not to study the stars, not to study the heavenly bodies, but to use the study of the heavenly bodies as a way of moving beyond them to even higher contemplation. In astronomy, as in geometry, we should employ problems, leave the heavens alone if we would approach the subject in the right way and make the natural gift of reason to be of any real use. So it's not about telescopes. It's not about NASA coming up with better and bigger telescopes and looking at the stars more accurately and all this stuff. That's really not what the concern is. It's an abstract meditation on the celestial bodies, using what we know of them to allow the soul, by means of contemplation, to move beyond them, to contemplate things that are eternal, of which they're merely signs. So that's the purpose of astronomy. And then lastly, music. As the eyes are designed to look at the stars, so the ears are designed to hear harmonious motions. This is something that's natural to us. God gave us this faculty. We are attracted to harmony. We can't explain why. It's just part of our nature, but it's the reason why the study of music is necessary for the pursuit of this human happiness. They investigate the numbers of the harmonies which are heard. This is talking about the Pythagoreans and what they get wrong. They investigate the numbers of the harmonies which are heard, but they never attain to problems. That is to say, they never reach the natural harmonies of number or reflect on why. The question why. Some numbers are harmonious and some others are not. And by numbers, he's talking about ratios. What's the word he uses? Intervals, right? The different measures of relations between tones. And when they're combined, whether it's pleasant to the soul or whether it's discordant. So, what is it that makes the soul respond in that way? There's something mysterious. The soul is almost revealing a secret code built into it that recognizes certain patterns, certain numbers, as he says here. Well, we need to investigate that because there must be a science to it. And when we understand that science, we'll be able to make use of whatever that faculty is that's at work within us. And we do that through the study of music. Again, not some kind of practical music, learning how to play in a symphony or play an instrument or even sing in a choir. That's all great, but that's just a means. That's just a step that we use to ascend to something that's higher, to ask, if we hear a beautiful sound, to ask the question, why is that beautiful? What actually is going on in my soul that causes me to feel peace when I hear a certain musical harmony or sound? What is it? Why am I experiencing that? That's the study of music, all right? Then in this last paragraph, and I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this because this is going to be recorded, so we can, review it in the future. That's no problem. But this last paragraph is significant, and this gives us sort of the picture of the Platonic goal for mathematical studies. He says, when all these studies, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music all together, when these reach the point of intercommunion and connection with one another, and they come to be considered in their mutual affinities, then, I think, but not till then, will the pursuit of them have a value for our objects. Otherwise, there is no profit in them. So the conclusion here that Plato makes is that this is an all or nothing pursuit. We pursue this knowledge of the mathematical sciences all the way where they're able to reach this point of intercommunion and connection with one another. They all sort of inform each other and work together to form this system of wisdom and contemplation. And if we don't reach that, it's going to prove to be a waste of time, because that's really where the benefits are to be found. And you can see how this sets a goal for the philosopher and says, go get it. If you can get it, you're going to experience this contemplative life in which happiness consists. But you've got to devote everything you have to it. And it begins to sound just like the book of Proverbs, which says that if we seek wisdom as for silver and seek it at the expense of everything else, we will obtain it. You can see that's the message of Platonic philosophy. And mathematics provides sort of the stairway to heaven, I guess I could say. That just came to me. It's cheesy, but that's what it presents, okay? So it's this idea of mathematics ascending above material things. We're not interested in arithmetic for the sake of engineering or architecture or calculations. We're not interested in geometry for the sake of measuring the volume of a bowl or a cup or calculating the area of land. We're not interested in astronomy to make a calendar or measure the distances between the celestial bodies. We're not interested in music to make better sounding compositions or to play the flute better. All of those things are just material steps that we take to ascend beyond them to the real intellectual considerations in the mathematical arts and sciences. And when we do that, we'll begin to ascend to the good, as he says, and intellectually contemplate those things that never change. Now, we can find teaching that sounds just like this in the New Testament. St. Paul, for example, says, if you are risen with Christ, seek the things that are above. That's that idea of, you claim to be a child of God, you claim to be a son of eternity. Well, then get your thoughts and get your affections where they belong. Seek the things that are above. That sounds very Platonic. And you can see why Christianity and Platonism developed this relationship between each other, because the systems seem to teach the same ideas. Jesus telling his disciples, don't seek the things the Gentiles seek, but seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness. That sounds very Platonic. So you can see why Christians embraced it so much. But the last line, again, Socrates or Plato, depending on how we think about it, says, all this is but the prelude to the actual strain which we have to learn. And then he goes off in the Republic talking about the science of dialectic, which is a whole different conversation. We can actually talk about that when we talk about reasoning, if you'd like to. It doesn't mean the study of logic. Remember, Aristotle developed the science of logical reasoning and analytics, so that's obviously not what Plato's talking about. It wasn't even in existence then. He's talking about dialectic, which is something different. So that's all for our time tonight. It's 9:55. I got through the chronology, thankfully, and I got through this, distillation, I'll call it, of book 7 of Plato's Republic. And I think now, if I'll give you a link to this real quick. If you take this document, take this stuff, and just spend some time reading through it, thinking about it, jotting down some questions and thoughts that arise, we'll begin to develop some interesting topics for discussions that we can follow up on in future weeks. Like I said, we can talk about this stuff on the forum if you're interested, or in future meetings. We could just take weeks where we just take some time for some open discussion. So let me just share Socrates on mathematics. I'll give you that link there. And then the other document we didn't get to talk about, which is Ptolemy on mathematics. I'll give you that link as well, just for the fun of it. The consolation prize. Maybe we'll talk about Ptolemy next week because it's important stuff. All right, so that's what I wanted to share tonight, an introduction to the mathematical sciences in ancient philosophy. But what I really want to emphasize is this isn't some boring college philosophy study. The whole point of this is that Plato's arguing that this is the means to human happiness. This isn't a study about what did Plato say and what did he say and what did Hegel say and what did Plato's saying this is the way to happiness. This is what human beings need to do intellectually to actually fulfill the ends of their souls. What their souls are craving for is this freedom from all of the distraction and misery of human life in this constantly changing material world that's filled with death and change and uncertainty. The soul wants certainty. The soul wants eternity. The soul wants stability and truth and all of these virtuous things that never change. And it's the duty of the philosopher to learn how to bring his soul into that place and then keep it there. And that's what Aristotle would explain to be the contemplative life. So that's where this is headed. That's what I wanted to introduce this week, because these studies of the four mathematical arts, it's not just a bunch of, esoteric philosophical babble that we're going to talk about. I have zero interest in that kind of talk. I have zero interest in academic discussions of these subjects. For me, this is all about my own Christian life, my own sanctification, my own happiness, my own, practical obedience to God's commandments. And if philosophy can help me in that life, that's the philosophy that I'm interested in. And when we understand philosophy in that way, we find that's what St. Thomas was interested in. That's what St. Augustine was interested in. That's what Cicero and Seneca and Aristotle and Plato, that's what they were all interested in. They were good, honest, even the pagans, they're called the virtuous pagans because they were seeking to live virtuously, which is for them the definition of human happiness. And so that's what real philosophy is about. It's about seeking happiness. And Plato teaches us that the mathematical sciences are part of the process by which we do that. So I hope that's a helpful introduction. I hope it introduces lots of questions, gets you thinking. And what I'd like you to do now is look over the Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum, look at the Quadrivium courses. You can open them up, knock around in them, and you'll start to have an idea of what's going on here, that this isn't just a bunch of random stuff. This is all part of Christian intellectual life. And it's a life that is largely lost in modern society. And I would argue, this is my opinion, but I would be willing to argue it. I would argue that the principal reason why there's a loss of vocations in Catholic circles today is because we no longer understand or appreciate the contemplative life. And past generations of Catholics did. They understood this stuff. They taught it in schools. And that's why I believe there was never a shortage of vocations, because this is what vocations are for. It's this separation from the crowd, separation from the mob and all the junk of everyday life, separation for the sake of this ascent to the good. That's what contemplation is. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share. What I'm going to do now is stop this recording, and then we'll just be private. We can talk about anything you guys would like to talk about, chat, or you're free to go, up to you. All right. So thanks for coming. I hope that was helpful. If there's anything that you'd like me to share with you, or you missed these links or anything, just let me know and I'll get them to you by email. All right. I hope that was helpful. God bless.